Hey there, community bankers. Welcome back to another episode of the Correspondent podcast. I'm your host, Madison Kaplinger, Marketing Associate for ICBB. Now, a question that seems to be heavy on the minds of community bankers and especially community bank marketers is how to capture the attention and the business of the younger demographic. Generation Z, the oldest of whom are in their early to mid-20s, comprises 40% of U.S. consumers. And millennials, the oldest of whom are in their early 40s, are not far behind them. But having grown up with technology for so much of their lives means that their consumer and banking behavior can be quite different from the older generations. So how does a community bank get their business? I sat down with Brian Reilly of BankBound, a digital marketing agency for financial institutions, to discuss this very question. Brian is very knowledgeable about all things digital and bank marketing, and as a marketing nerd myself, I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you come away with some ideas to implement at your community bank. Hey, community bankers. I'm here with Brian Reilly of BankBound. Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Pleasure to be here, Madison. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So tell us a little bit about you and your professional background and about BankBound. What do you do?
Sure. So I'm a marketing nerd. I love all things digital marketing. And so about 7 years ago, I came on board here at Print Mail Solutions, a very bank focused company that has been doing data integration, statement outsourcing, e statements, and other sort of related functions for banks for a long time. But we wanted to expand our digital marketing services for banks. And so kind of took all the knowledge that I had from previous agencies and other experiences to help build out a team here called BankBound. And so at this point, we work exclusively with local banks on measurable marketing. So all things digital marketing kind of fall under that umbrella, and that's what we love doing.
That's awesome because I know that's such a need for community banks, that marketing expertise.
I would agree. I'm a little biased, of course, but I think we could probably
Right.
all agree that there's just not enough hours in the day. There's not enough people on the team, the resources in marketing. I don't know.
Mhm.
I've just never met a marketer who said, I've got too much time and too many people and too much budget. What should I do with it? So that's really where we can kind of come in and really add that additional firepower for teams that just want to get more done and take their digital marketing to the next level.
Into that. Um, yeah, for sure. I'll identify myself as a fellow digital marketing nerd, so it's good to meet another one and talk to another one.
Yeah, absolutely.
So today we're talking about attracting the coveted Gen Z millennial market. Everyone wants them, including banks. So let's set some definitions. Who is Gen Z and who are the millennials?
Good question. And as much as I hate to paint in broad strokes, because obviously there's difference of opinion on some of these things, but I think generally it's been said the Gen Z folks are in the mid 90s to 2010 ish. Is when they were born. So at this point in time, they're likely in their teens or early 20s, and then the millennial audience is early 80s to mid 90s. So at this point, they're more so in their late 20s to early 40s.
Gotcha. Okay. So what are some things that kind of characterize those generations? And I'd be happy to chime in here because
Mhm.
as a mid 90s baby, I'm kind of right between the Gen Z and millennial mark.
Right, and it's interesting. There's a lot of opinions. There's a lot of research. Um, and obviously there's some variation between folks that were born at one end of the spectrum or other, or like yourself in between. So I'd
Right.
say, I guess, from my own observation and some of the research that I've read, I think the Gen Z folks are often characterized, and again, this is kind of broad strokes, but um, they're really into hyper personalization, individual truth. They're not easily categorized, and so they have this sort of this very subjective worldview. I think is perhaps one way to describe a generalized observation from that group. Whereas the millennials, um, I think that these folks are in a phase of life where they're a little bit further along. They're getting married, they're having families, they're buying homes and so forth. They've been through 9/11, they've been through the financial crashes of 2008 and so forth. So some of those things have really shaped, I think, their worldview quite a bit. Um, but they also can remember a time when the internet and mobile phones weren't really readily available for everyone. So they have perhaps a little bit of a different perspective on how to engage with people and businesses, whereas the Gen Z folks are digitally native. I mean, they don't really remember a time when there wasn't a phone in their hands or nearby at least to capture things and engage with people. So both obviously being very digitally savvy audiences for sure.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also add, I think Gen Z is probably more socially conscious than the generations before,
Hmm. Absolutely, I agree with that.
which is, I think, probably a result of just access to information of what's going on in the world.
Right. Yeah, for better or worse, right? It's like information
Right.
overload. It was kind of like a double-edged sword, but for sure, I think that they're likely uh, well advanced in researching and understanding most anything. I think and even the millennials to some extent. I'm in that category as far as being a millennial, and so I know we serve as a sort of research engine for a lot of the older folks in our
Yeah.
lives as they're trying to figure out how to do things and track things down. So information is is very um, fluid and certainly a big part of our lives day to day.
Right, for sure. So, what's the banking situation for Gen Z and millennials? Are they using community banks? Are they using the big banks, online banks, or something else entirely? Maybe they're unbanked.
Right. Yeah, this is also interesting. There's so many studies out there, and I think what I've largely found and seems to be anecdotally true with other folks that I know is that given how digitally oriented both of these groups are, they largely prefer digital channels, and I think the perception of a better mobile banking experience, unique features, and so forth primarily lands them with mega banks, with the biggest banks in the country. I think a larger percentage of them than other generations use digital banks, but as far as I can observe or understand from some of the research out there, it seems like the mega banks really are the sort of go-to institution for both of these generations. So I think I saw something like 70% of them claim a large bank as their primary institution, which is definitely a challenge for community banks for sure.
Right, definitely, because the bigger banks, they have the scale to provide more of those digital tools, and the community banks are kind of left behind in that front a lot of the time, unfortunately, trying to play catch up.
Right, right. The investment required, the people, the personnel, yeah, definitely presents some big challenges to overcome.
Right. And it's kind of interesting that to me that Gen Z particularly are using big banks because I think the kind of socially conscious perception is that, the big banks are bad.
Mhm.
And but it's like, well, this institution sucks, but they've got a good app, so I'll bite the bullet.
Right, right. Yeah, I agree. There's like sort of this strange yeah, I don't know how to best describe it, but the convenience sort of like overrules some of those social concerns. I think both from like a technology standpoint and also carries over into personal finances as well. So it's an interesting sort of situation, but one that certainly I think community banks are well positioned to lean into and
Mhm.
demonstrate themselves as a better alternative for sure. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. So, what do you think makes is unique about each of these generations that might make them an attractive community bank customer? I mean,
Mhm.
of course, as a community bank, you want to draw in all the customers you can, but do you think there's something kind of unique about the Gen Z and the millennial segment that makes them kind of more ideal than we realize as a community bank customer.
Sure. I think, I mean, just naturally, I think they have inherent value, just because the sort of concentration of deposits for most banks is really in those higher or older age groups, especially like 45 and older. And so, with that high density of deposits in older generations, I think it's just going to become more and more important to look to these newer generations to bring on as far as sustaining um, each of these banks and their deposit base. So that's definitely, I think, just a natural progression that's in the works. But if you think about also sort of the life phases of where these folks are, the millennial group, again, largely. In the home buying phase, I think I saw something like 70% of them are looking to purchase a home in the next few years. They're starting families, they're moving around for work and that sort of thing. So they represent a pretty large segment there, especially when it comes to home lending. And then the Gen Z group, maybe not quite there yet as
Hmm.
far as home buying, but they're entering the workforce, and they're certainly starting to do a lot of new things that they need help with in the way of learning how to bank, learning how to invest and save, buying a car, paying down college debt, whatever that might be. So um, I think they both offer some unique opportunities, and perhaps maybe another sort of double-edged sword here is that both groups seemingly are more inclined to switch banks for
Mm,
new features or for better financial advice or better rates.
yeah.
Obviously, that presents some challenges on the other side, but pulling them away from their primary institution might be easier than some other age groups that have come before them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Generational groups seem to not have the same degree of brand loyalty than
Mhm.
as maybe older generations. And I think the perception is, well, you know, this company, they're not like sitting around worrying about me, so why would I put energy into worrying about, being loyal to them? Um,
Right, right, exactly.
yeah. And you kind of alluded to this a minute ago, with just the phases of life that these generations are in. But what do you think are some unique financial and baking challenges that the millennials and Gen Z are going to be facing?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think both groups, given their life phases, have a number of challenges that community banks are well positioned to solve for them. Some of the more perhaps unique challenges that banks might want to consider thinking through more proactively. I think with both generations, we're seeing the traditional sources of income being a little bit different than previous generations. I mean, a lot of folks have multiple streams of income. They might do a lot of freelance work or day trade in cryptocurrency or whatever it is. So I think credit might present some challenges.
Mm,
Applying for credit might be something that is a little bit more unique of a process for them to understand their credit worthiness. I think both obviously are going to place a high emphasis on the digital experience that the bank offers. So for banks, absolutely, there's a challenge there in sort of stepping away from the default mobile banking features that your core provider is handing down to you and looking for something that's going to be more competitive, I think, and draw them to switch banks. And then really that kind of carries into just generally the digital service that the expectations they have on their financial provider to provide them with immediate service, the way that they want to be served in different channels at different times. So the sort of traditional banking hours are a big problem, I think, for these generations, especially when it comes to how they want to engage with these brands online as well.
yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. And you kind of raised something that even I hadn't thought about is the traditional banking hours being an issue. Um,
Mhm.
because I think it's so easy now to, get immediate feedback or immediate gratification in so much of what we do that it makes sense that that expectation would carry over into banking,
Exactly.
regardless of, how we've kind of operated for decades and decades.
Mhm. Right. So these folks are used to 24/7 live support from a lot of other institutions that they utilize for their daily life, and so when that doesn't carry over into their banking experience, that creates some friction for sure. I think the expectations are a bit different for these digitally native customers and prospects for sure.
Yeah. Do you see big banks needing meeting that need, and do you see community banks meeting that need? Is there kind of a disconnect with either one?
I think the when it comes to traditional service, uh, community banks have always excelled here. I think it's what has um, largely been the the biggest selling point of the community bank is that relationship based banking model that's carried them through decades of different economic challenges and so forth. But the digital experience, carrying that over into the digital presence of these community banks, I think has been a challenge. I don't know that community banks are really competing on the same level as some of the major mega banks, and of course the digital banks, which have a much lighter model, and that can be available any time of day, any time of night. Sometimes
Yeah.
with live agents, with chat, video, text, schedule an appointment, all these things that just sort of meet people where they want to communicate. I think is a real differentiator for the big banks at this point in time.
It's interesting you mentioned the kind of relationship aspect of community banking and that being a really strong selling point, because I think you're definitely right there. But from hearing from community bankers, I think there's this perception that the digital experience kind of erodes that relational um, expectation, that the digital experience that we're seeking is more impersonal, um, and that they're not going to be able to recreate that relationship and that personal service in a digital space. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. I think there's some truth to that for sure. Um, I mean, you kind of see a conversation is a little different, email to email, text message to text message, and in comparison to an in-person conversation. I think the challenge is that we can't really put our expectations on the digital service, sort of forcing people in branch because we know it's going to be a better experience. We have to really meet them where they're most comfortable. And that doesn't mean that they won't start a conversation online in a chat format and then end up scheduling an appointment to come into a branch and actually have that face to face interaction. I think most of the data out there would indicate that even the digitally native people, and maybe even more so, because of how unique that personal interaction is. While they may prefer digital channels and the convenience of them, kind of at their own pace and at their own time and channel preference, they greatly value that personal communication and at least knowing that it's available. So I think the two can really work together and offer community banks a really unique advantage in that if they can offer the same sort of digital experience that we know they're capable of and have done so for so long in branch, and marry the two together, I think that's a really powerful combination of service that will really meet people wherever their expectations might be, and really and build great relationships that are different from those big banks and the digital banks that are out there.
Absolutely. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think the thing that needs to change is, maybe not the entire relationship based model, but I think maybe our perception of we need to kind of rethink how we see the customer journey.
Hmm.
Because I think for Millennial and Gen Z, it's going to start online. They're not likely to just pull up to a bank branch and, walk in and ask for information. They're going to Google, bank near me, or maybe the name of the bank, and they're going to kind of feel out the bank or maybe their lender online. And then there's potential there, I think, for that to drive them into the branch to make that appointment, like you said.
Hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. I think the user journey is pretty well fragmented at this point, and it's just kind of a
Hmm.
spider web of touch points, but they can definitely all work together. And so, if you've got the tools and the resources to extend that relationship model online, I think there's really a net gain in total engagement across that spectrum of touch points that your prospects are likely going to do, whether you want them to or not. It's just sort of
Hmm.
part of the the buying process now. I think for most folks is to start online, do your own research, and then when you're comfortable, taking it to the next step, and you find that credible institution that you want to continue talking with, then yes, there's absolutely still interested in meeting in person and having that relationship built inside of a branch. So yeah, I think they're very complementary.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, do you think, to kind of switch gears a little bit here, do you think that, these generations we're talking about are more or less financially literate than the ones before? Because I've kind of heard arguments to the effect of both ways. So, do you think they're more or less financially literate than, say, their parents' generation?
Yeah, interesting question. I think as you get older, you naturally get a little more financially literate, either through good or bad personal experience. You just kind of
Yeah.
bump your way along and kind of gain that knowledge over time. So I think naturally, younger audiences are sort of at a disadvantage when it comes to financial literacy. They just haven't had those life experiences or the necessity to learn things on the financial spectrum. So I don't know. I think honestly, every generation universally wants and needs help with their finances, which is
Yeah.
great news, for community banks who have been doing this well for both businesses and consumers for decades, right? But I think the challenge perhaps for the younger audiences is that being digitally native, like we talked about before, is they're going out and researching and finding all this information. There's just so much of it. It's almost just information overload. So I really feel
Yeah.
like finances remain stressful and overwhelming for most people, but especially younger generations, which again presents a great opportunity for community banks.
Yeah, for sure. And, the thing with, finding information in the digital realm is it's just as easy to find bad information as good information.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, there's a challenge there as well.
Absolutely.
And yeah, without life experience, the younger generations are just kind of at the mercy of whatever they've been taught, good or bad, right or wrong, nothing
Right.
or a
And
lot.
lots of conflicting opinions, lots of new
Yes,
channels out there. So, yeah, there's a lot to sift through. And that's really where the trusted advisor role that the local community bank can play, I think, is really invaluable for folks that are working through that.
for sure. So to kind of shift focus to from the customer to the community bank. So how we've talked a lot about what the needs and the expectations are from the millennial and the Gen Z customer, but just on a practical level, how do you think community banks can kind of start to meet those needs that we've expressed?
Sure. I think there's really no way around it. I think community banks need to invest more. That's probably not what anybody wants to hear, but
Right.
investing in people, investing in technology, investing in partners. I know really the whole COVID situation really accelerated a lot of that investment in a hurry. So many banks out there on the community banking level are already undergoing some pretty big digital transformation and other initiatives related to that. But that's just going to have to be a continued, um, investment on the part of the banks to remain competitive in this space. But um, I think meeting those needs really one thing to keep in mind while all of those transformations are in flight. Uh, and I notice that a lot of banks kind of are working these projects in silos a little bit. I think community banks
Yeah.
should really leverage industry trade groups, state banking networks, other bank specific organizations like ICBB, where you can gain efficiencies and accelerate best practices. I think that there's not necessarily the need to always reinvent the wheel when it comes to meeting these sort of challenges head on. So I would definitely encourage banks to participate in those resources that are out there.
Yeah, for sure. And, I do you have any kind of practical advice for, and maybe you don't, and that's okay. Maybe it's just a matter of kind of recognizing that need and biting the bullet. But do you have any practical advice for, you know, finding a way to make that investment in the technology without, I guess, without, I guess, making that feasible and making that practical and doable for a community bank with a finite number of resources?
Hmm. Right. It's definitely challenging. I think every bank is a little different in the team that they have in place, the technology stack that they have in place, for better or worse. So it's a lot. A lot of these projects are enormous initiatives. They require, I think, first and foremost, a really strong internal team to really champion different initiatives, to get out there and understand all of the options, to talk with other bankers who have been through these initiatives already. So I think that's probably where I would say a primary focus should be up front, is making sure that your team has the capacity to take these things head on, and
Mm,
then of course the investment is more substantiated thereafter, once you have a champion who can actually see these things through and make sure the investment is worthwhile. So attending trade shows, participating in trade associations, meeting with other bankers and other bank specific organizations. I think having giving the internal teams the capacity to do that will position them to really walk through some of these bigger projects and initiatives.
yeah, that's good advice. Don't try to do it alone, community banks.
Absolutely, yeah. You might drown for sure. That's
Mhm.
a challenging
Yeah.
space.
So we've talked about, what makes a community bank kind of attractive to a Gen Z or millennial customer. The technology and the digital experience is definitely a big piece of it. And then you throw in what's attractive to everyone, great rates and things like that. Is there anything else you would add that would make a community bank attractive to that demographic?
I do. I think. Well, and maybe I've kind of touched on it already. I do think that given the sort of information overload for younger generations that exists out there, community banks really do offer sort of the original personalized experience with real humans and not
Yeah.
bots. And so I think that is kind of overlooked a little bit in sort of how the banks are positioning themselves and what they do well and how they can help people. And obviously, we talked about digital service being of utmost importance, but yeah, really just kind of carrying that through into the digital presence that they have in their website and other technology, and how they engage and interact with customers and prospects. I think those would be of great interest, and just kind of telling that story that you have. The bank is built on a relational model, and you know in tandem with the features and service and products that you have, that's definitely a unique uh, differentiator, I think, in contrast to the sort of experience that most of us have felt dealing with much larger financial institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that you kind of use the phrase of like telling that story because I mean, you and I know that's kind of a big marketing
Hmm.
buzzword, I guess, the buzz phrase,
Yep,
more like
definitely.
telling, yeah, telling the story, which kind of leads us into, the practical, like we know, what they want, we know who we're talking to, we know what they want. And the next step is, kind of telling them that we have it. So if we can kind of talk promotion for a minute, that fourth P of the
Sure.
four P's of marketing. Um, what kind of messaging do you think is going to be effective to reach millennials and Gen Z? And not just, what kind of messaging, how do you tell that story, but, where do you tell that story? Where are they spending their time that you can place that message for them
Mhm.
to see.
Sure, sure. Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, well, first and foremost, you've got to have, what they're looking for, right? So we talked about
Yeah.
investing in technology and features that are attractive to them, but helping them understand that, these um, digital experience and service are not uniquely owned by big banks. I think that's just a misconception that a lot of banks perhaps haven't put enough effort into sort of their messaging around, you can have that experience digitally that the big banks have to offer, but also the sort of hometown relational banking relationship combined, into a single message. I think that's worth considering. And as far as of reaching these folks and kind of talking with them where they spend time. I think that there's a heavy emphasis, of course, in these younger generations on social media, and so one channel that's always been very effective through those mediums. More so in other industries, I think that's a little bit harder in the banking space, but definitely messaging through peers or
Hmm.
influencer marketing, as it's referred to. I think this can be an effective channel, even in the banking space. Banks have a lot of very well networked executives and lenders that I don't think are often activated to sort of represent the bank as influencers and all different age groups. But not to mention, like we talked about before, these their social causes are near and dear to a lot of younger folks. Local banks are partners with so many great local community organizations and nonprofits. I think that also represents good channel and good message to co-promote relevant solutions and causes, and really humanize the message and the brand itself, and add that much more credibility. So it's sort of like a win-win-win situation where you're working with local institutions that are doing good work in your community. You're helping to promote them. They're helping to promote you. That work is of value to the people that you want to get in front of. And so I think that aligning those things can be a real win for local community banks. And yeah, I think, just kind of making those pieces relevant and align with what's top of mind in the lives of younger audiences. Like we mentioned before, they're doing a lot of things that they've never done before. So, purchasing a car, buying a home, thinking through investment strategy. There's a lot of opportunities there to sort of to help those people through those challenges, and in the process align your campaigns and messaging around social causes or through peer networks that might be of a special interest to them.
Yeah, I mean, that whole piece that you just said is just packed with fantastic advice. I think you mentioned like influencer marketing. And I think when you say the word influencer marketing, people think of Instagram,
Mhm.
right? And they like Instagram models and Instagram influencers. But, on the community bank level, I think that can be kind of hyper local. You know,
Absolutely.
I, I think a lot of small towns kind of have their local celebrities. And so there are opportunities there to kind of leverage those very local relationships.
Hmm. Absolutely. I think so. And if I think the influencer model is a little more challenging in the service industry and
That's
in the
true.
banking industry, but rather than like retail or e-commerce or something where there's they have a visual product that they can kind of give away and promote. But yeah, there's nothing against recruiting and building your own influencer network. I mean, keep in mind these folks that are digitally native are very well connected and would probably enjoy sort of working with an organization that aligns with their worldview, the things that they care about, the community organizations they care about. And so yeah, you can either find them and pay them to participate in your influencer program, or perhaps recruit some local influencers in your hometown as well. There's different ways to go about it.
So you touched on platforms and being kind of available and present digitally. So I'm going to ask kind of a controversial bank marketing question, or at least, it seems controversial because I've heard some very strong opinions about it either way. Um, should community banks be on TikTok to reach particularly Gen Z, but millennials are on the app too?
Right.
What are kind of risks, benefits there of having a presence on the app?
Sure, sure. Yes, TikTok is there's so much hype around TikTok at the moment. I think it's a tricky question. Probably my short answer would be um, banks should be on
Mm.
TikTok. Yes, it's worth experimenting with some educational or entertaining sort of content. Give it a shot. However, I think my sort of long-winded answer about the question of what to do with TikTok would be that experimentation on that platform should really happen after a number of other higher priority digital marketing items are in flight. I can sort of
Yeah.
kind of walk through a few of those that I would probably say would take a higher precedence than TikTok. So, for example, a lot of the banks that we work with on digital marketing, they don't have a great um, setup or configuration of their own data analytics, right? So measuring
Mm.
goals across digital marketing, across channels, including TikTok. If you can't measure it, it's pretty difficult to make any sense of what results or impact you're truly having. So I always start there. Let's get the data tracking and goals configured so we can understand performance. Not just on TikTok, but across all digital channels where there is so much data readily available. Um, and then I think even beyond that, once we're able to track goals, a lot of financial institutions don't really have defined social media goals established. So short term, mid range, and long term goals. And now that we can track some of those metrics, we've got to make sure that what we're investing in and the resources we're allocating to a channel like TikTok are actually reaching those goals and make sense for us to continue doing. And then even before you get to TikTok, Facebook and YouTube have significantly more active users on their
Right.
platforms than TikTok. So if it's the case that a bank doesn't yet have a established presence on Facebook and YouTube, where yeah, even a lot of Gen Z are still active on Facebook, definitely active on YouTube. If you're a commercial bank, you should be on LinkedIn for sure, right? So there's some other channels that I think are still, and maybe this will, maybe be worth editing next year. This time next year, who knows where social media is going to go? But I think those channels
Right.
still represent a much bigger share of your existing customer base and target prospects. So I wouldn't jump into TikTok before getting those pieces in line. And then I think kind of where we started, the limited resources available for any bank marketing department really necessitate that just a prioritization of the most
Mhm.
valuable or highest converting digital marketing channels. So I would say maybe they're not as much fun as TikTok, but with
Sure.
of all the local banks that we've worked with here at BankBound over the years, we've always found much higher conversion rates from search engine optimization, search engine advertising, and email marketing. So it's definitely worth prioritizing, even though, like I said, it may be maybe a little bit less fun to work through those channels, but we've got to allocate resources where we're going to see the biggest impact.
Right. That that's a good answer, and that makes I would agree with you that, maybe, if you have a little bit of, time and energy and resources to spare, try out TikTok. But yeah, there are definitely things I think that should take precedence
Mhm.
that are going to be
Absolutely.
higher converting. Yeah.
Yep. So not a short answer, but I think prioritization is definitely key.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I think our community bankers and community bank marketers are going to get a lot out of this conversation, things that I hope they take back to their banks with them. So, thank you for just coming and sharing your expertise with us.
Absolutely happy to do it. It's my pleasure to talk with you, and I hope that in the midst of all the ramblings, there's something that might be a good takeaway for your listeners. So again, thanks for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks, Madison.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you've gotten some value from this conversation to take back to your community bank. Make sure to follow or subscribe to The Correspondent wherever you get your podcasts and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. See you next time.